You're listening to Policy Room by SPRF.
Hi, thank you for tuning into Policy Room. I'm Neha Satyaprakash, and today we're speaking to Professor Avinash Collis. Professor Avinash is an assistant professor at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a digital fellow at the Stanford University Digital Economy Lab and the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. He holds a PhD in Management Sciences from the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Today, we'll be speaking to him regarding his research on the economics of digitization. We're very excited to have you on board.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. Thanks for inviting me to speak about my research.
It's our pleasure. And let's dive right in. A central argument that you make in some of your papers is that the real value of the digital economy can be measured accurately by valuing the benefits that people derive from digital goods as opposed to how much they actually pay for it, given that most digital services like, say, Twitter or WhatsApp, or even news in some cases, they don't really cost the user anything. And I find that very interesting. But I'm also curious from an economic or a scientific standpoint is as to how you go about actually measuring those benefits. Could you walk us through the methodology or the technique that you use in your research?
Yeah, sure, Neha. So before I go into the methodology, maybe I can briefly describe the background for why this question is important and why we should study this. So if you look at most of the macroeconomic measures which we use, every day, by policymakers and journalists, the most common measures we use are, GDP and other measures which we derive from GDP, such as productivity. And then we use changes in these metrics over time and use them as proxies for changes in well-being. But it's important to note that these are measures of production and not well-being. They don't aim to capture the benefits which we get from various goods. They try to measure the production side of the economy. But for most of the 20th century, right, like the goods which we used on a daily basis, like these are goods with positive prices. Take products such as like cars or food. The more you consume those products, the more money you spend in the economy. It would show up in GDP and productivity. And your well-being also, is correlated with how much you spend on it, and it increases as well over time. But what's different in the digital economy context is, as you were mentioning, most of the digital products which we consume every day, like, search engines and social media platforms, they're free to consumers. Like, you don't directly pay a price to access them. Sometimes there might be advertising revenues for some of these platforms, but like not always. So in this digital economy context, the relationship between how much of it gets captured in GDP and productivity, and the benefits which these products generate to consumers breaks down. So these two metrics need not be correlated anymore. And to motivate you, if you look at the share of the information sector, the IT sector, as a percentage of the overall economy, in most of the advanced economies, it's at around 4 to 5% for the last 40, 50 years. So the share of the IT sector, as a whole economy, like it's not changing over time.
Okay, all right.
But, all of us would agree, right? All of us would agree that, we spend much more time online. Technology plays a much bigger role today than it did 40 years ago. And so this was like the motivating fact behind our research. And so basically the methodology which we use is, instead of looking at the production side of these products, we go and directly measure the consumer surplus or the consumer welfare which these goods generate. And as you know from Econ 101, right, like consumer surplus, it's defined as basically the value you get from consuming a product minus the price you pay for, purchasing that product. And in the context of free digital goods, you're not paying anything to like buy that product. So we go and directly measure how much value you get from using platforms such as Facebook or WhatsApp or Google search. And the way we do that is, by running lots of large scale online choice experiments. So all of us already have access to these products. So what we do is, because in order to put a price on these products, we go and run experiments online, where we offer people monetary incentives. Let's say, $10 of cash or $50 of cash, in exchange for giving up access to like Facebook or Google or Wikipedia or one of these platforms. So we make these offers online and on a large scale to thousands of people, see if they accept the offer or not. And these are not just hypothetical survey questions, but in some experiments, we have actually given out real monetary incentives. We
Okay.
monitor, if people give up these products or not. So these are like incentive compatible experiments where we offer like, real cash and see if they give up this product or not. And then once you run these experiments on a large scale at different price levels, you can estimate demand curves for these products, even if they are zero priced. For example, you can see, at $5, what's the percentage of the population which gives up, let's say, Facebook, and at $10 and $20. So you have prices and quantities, on both axes. You can estimate the demand curve. And once you have demand curves, you can go ahead and measure consumer surplus, consumer welfare, and that is a proxy. That is a better proxy for the benefits which we get from the digital revolution, as opposed to looking at production measures.
That's a wonderful way of thinking about it. I think it ignited a couple of questions in my mind about how much I would pay to give up a certain
Yeah.
digital good. And I really particularly like the method because there's no question of whether people are lying about their preferences or anything because they are actually forced to give up the good. So I find that very interesting. And I'm also very curious about its findings. Also, the first question that pops into my mind is, do people generally tend to value a certain category of digital goods over the other? In in other words, say, do people on average value social media platforms over search engines or e-commerce websites? What have the trends look like on that end?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, going into the research agenda, like my prior was, that people really value social media platforms a lot, and that is true. But when we compare social media and other categories, what we find is that the most valued category of digital goods is actually search engines, like platforms such as Google and Bing. And the reason is, it's really hard to imagine a life without search engines. Like, search engines are basically the first step online, right? Before you find a website and go elsewhere in order to discover information. There is no good substitute out there. If we take away access to search engines, it's really hard to like basically do any kind of
Yeah,
knowledge job, like your job and my job. So search engines, at least in the context of the US and Europe, are the most highly valued category of digital goods. What we find is that in the US, search engines generate around over $15,000 to $18,000 of welfare for the median American every year. So that's like a huge surplus. Part of that welfare could also be, because of your job. Like
right.
you,
Yeah.
many of us cannot do our jobs if we take search engines away. But a big chunk of it also comes from like using it for non-work activities as well. And followed by search engines, the next big category is email. Email is like, yeah, also very important. Like you cannot live without an email address, and that was around $8,000 a year. Followed by that, we find that maps are also highly valued at around $3,500. It's really hard to navigate your way
For sure.
not just in a new city but in your current city. Like even sometimes like your everyday commute, like you just rely on the navigation device like Google Maps. And then on the other end we have platforms like social media which generate around $400 to $500 of consumer surplus every year, and messaging apps like around $200 in surplus. So that is also a big number when you think about it,
Right.
but it's
Yeah.
still an order of magnitude less than search engines and email and maps. Yeah.
Right. That is also quite interesting because when I think of digital media, I think of my social media applications more than I think of search engines or Gmail because I've taken them as granted at this point, which would also explain why it
Yeah.
is so highly valued. So, and I also wanted to know, um, like within social media, this brings me to my next question. Um, what may cause people to value a certain platform over the other? For example, I, for one, know that I value Instagram over Facebook, but I can't really identify why. So, is there an academic explanation for this preference?
Yeah, so the social media category is interesting because most of the value which we get from social media platforms comes from network effects, right? So basically, network effects means that the more friends you have, the more connections you have on a platform, the more you value that platform. So depending on the context, right, and depending on the country, depending on your age, uh, most of your connections might be on one platform over another platform. And if you want to be on the social media app where all of your friends are, and you also want to be on the social media app where all of the people you want to follow, including celebrities or whoever, are located, right? So in this category, the network effects play like the strongest role in determining how much you value these platforms. And a good example of this is WhatsApp, right? Take the case of WhatsApp. It's a simple app. Once you take away the network, there is nothing else left. In the context of Instagram and Facebook, like you still can follow like pages or follow celebrities. In the context of WhatsApp, it's a purely network driven product. All of the value comes from your network. And we find that, for example, in the European context, we did an experiment. So in the US, most people still use SMS. They don't really use
Oh,
WhatsApp,
okay.
which is surprising, right? Coming from India. And but in many countries in Europe and also in India and in many countries in the world, like WhatsApp is the primary communication device in order to stay in touch with your family, but also work colleagues. So what we find is that we did an experiment in Europe where we took away access to WhatsApp, and what we found is that the median subject in our experiment needed like over 400 euros to give up WhatsApp for a month. And that's a huge
That's,
amount of
yeah.
money. And this was a real experiment where they actually had to give it up. So in the Indian context as well, I would expect that, relative to your income level, if someone had to give up WhatsApp, like you really need to like pay them a big chunk compared to what they earn, in order to make them give it up, because it's really hard to imagine life without it. So for messaging apps and social media apps, like the biggest predictor of value comes from your network size. Yeah.
Right. That would also explain why, despite there being so many perfect substitutes to WhatsApp, like um, Signal and Telegram, people are so hesitant to shift because most of their network is
Yes,
already there.
exactly.
Right. And yeah,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
helps me
Yeah. Yeah.
explain my own behavior. And this also help. I can't help but wonder how much of my choices are influenced by my sociological background. So do you have any insights on how these consumer surplus values differ across, say, gendered lines or racial lines? Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the context of Facebook, we took a deeper dive into like what kinds of people get more value from like Facebook versus others. So what we found is that women value social media platforms like Facebook more than men.
Right.
So they seem to get more consumer surplus from using them. And in terms of age, what we find is, interestingly, like in the context of Facebook, older people get more value than younger people. And at first, that was a bit puzzling. And then once we took a deeper dive into the data, what we find is that the older you are, the less access to substitutes you have. Like
Oh,
if you're older, like you're only on Facebook, you don't use, you don't, you're less likely to use like Instagram or TikTok or one of these other platforms. But if you're younger, then you are on multiple different social media platforms and you readily give up access to Facebook and take the other platforms. So in terms of age, it's not a clear relationship. Like for some apps are valued more by older people, like Facebook. Some other apps like Instagram are valued more by younger people. And we also looked at income levels, and what we found is that, interestingly, there is no strong relationship with income. Both lower income and higher income people seem to get a lot of value and there was no significant relationship between what your income level is and how much you value Facebook or other social media platforms. So these were some results. We did not look at race yet, but in some ongoing work, we are taking a deeper dive into other like demographics, including race. Yeah.
All right. I'm very curious to know what happens on those lines as well. And coming back to what you had earlier mentioned about the GDP as a measure of welfare. So I was reading your paper on GDPB, and you essentially argue that as things stand, the current method to estimate a country's GDP does not accurately account for the welfare contributions, as you had said earlier. And I found that very interesting when you said that also, because in a lot of research, or in a lot of economic research at least, we simply take GDP numbers as given, right? We do not, a lot of it does not critically analyze what goes behind the GDP. And even when there are, say, prominent economists criticizing the methodology that is used to find the GDP, none of it comes from the angle of, right, the digital economy as you have researched, right? So, could you please share some of your key findings on this end? How much are we undervaluing our GDP on this front?
Yeah, so I think before I explain that, one thing I wanted to make it clear is that, GDP, I think, at least according to my view, does a really good job at measuring the production side of the economy.
Definitely, yeah.
So what I'm trying to say, through all of my research, so the aim is not to replace GDP. Like GDP, like it's called as one of the greatest invention of the 20th century. Like it was, like it's been like, improved, and like, people have developed methods to like properly measure various things which go into GDP, like intangibles, like, and it does a really good job at measuring production. And we should continue to, of course, measure the production side of the economy, because at the end of the day, that is like very important. But what I'm trying to say is, in parallel to production metrics, we should also be looking at welfare or well-being metrics. And that's where my research agenda comes in. And what we find, for example, is, like, so when we develop a new framework which directly captures the benefits which people get from the digital economy and other types of non-market products, we call that framework as GDPB, where B stands for benefits. And what we find is that, in the US, for example, the welfare contribution of Facebook, once you account for it, that leads to an extra growth in GDPB of around 0.05 to 0.1% every year. So that is pretty significant, given that it's just one product, Facebook. And when you account for all other types of social media platforms and search engines, like that contribution would be even higher. But that's just in the context of US. And in the European context, we also look at WhatsApp and other products. And what we find is that, for example, WhatsApp in Netherlands, where we did an experiment taking access away from WhatsApp from people, what we find is that once you account for the benefits of WhatsApp, that leads to a growth in GDPB of around 0.8% per year since WhatsApp was created. But again, it's important to note that it's a parallel metric. It's not like an apples to apples comparison with GDP. What is more interesting is to look at changes in these metrics over time. So, like look at changes in our GDPB metric over time, and what we find is that, over the past few years, the value which people get from digital goods like WhatsApp and Facebook, it's increasing. So our GDPB metric, which captures welfare, is also increasing. Again, one critique of this framework could be that, we are gaining in terms of welfare when it comes to digital goods, but we are probably losing welfare when it comes to other types of goods. For example, the more time you spend on social media or instant messaging, the less time you might spend meeting your friends in real life.
Correct.
So welfare increases in the context of digital goods. It might decrease in the context of like other types of interactions, like social interactions. So so we haven't captured the non-digital side of it, but like it would be useful to like for a full picture, to look at all of these different aspects.
Correct. Yes, that is also a trade-off I think that has been going on for a while in terms of people always discussing whether the environmental costs of extra infrastructure are valid. So I think that's also a very interesting trade-off to look into. And um, but my question then is, and I've been trying to think about this for a while, is how do you think your findings on the welfare contributions of digital economy can inform public policy better, given that, as far as I know at least, not a lot of research on this particular lines has happened. So how do you think this can inform public policy better?
Yeah, so I mean, the fundamental objective of public policy and of politicians and of policymakers is to improve the welfare of people, right? Like,
Yes.
and if you cannot measure something properly, you cannot manage it better, like manage it better, right?
Right.
So I think these metrics are important for like policymakers to keep track of, and then see, let's say there is a new policy when it comes to like access to broadband internet, and you want to keep track of, let's say, investment in broadband infrastructure, and see if that leads to improvement in well-being. So you would enact that policy, and then you would want to measure how much people are better off after they get access to better internet, because now they can access social media and search engine
Definitely.
on all these types of platforms. So I would say that those are some of the examples where these metrics are like first order importance. Like, let's say you're investing money on in a big project, you want to see if you improve the lives of people or not, and these metrics would help policymakers directly measure the well-being side of the economy.
Right. And I think, especially in the context of the pandemic, where everything has gone digital and like there's more conversation, more discourse than ever about the digital economy, I feel like having this sort of information could at least help us, prepare better.
Following up on that point, exactly, like during the pandemic, what we noticed is that different demographics, right, like had access to internet in different ways. Like some regions, for example, had really bad access to internet,
Oh, okay.
which means that they were not as ready as others in order to, like, let's say, switch online overnight. And that has major implications for well-being, right? Like, because everything shifted online over the
Right.
past
For sure.
year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So exactly, yeah, yeah.
Right. So, on that note, do you think, from a retrospective lens, was there any way that we could have prepared ourselves for this pandemic? In that, do you think this information having existed earlier, or at least a decade ago, perhaps, could have helped us prepare ourselves better for this pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. So, building up on my previous point, like, for example, measuring how much people are better off from these digital goods across different regions, across different demographics, across, different variables like gender and race. If we had that information, right, like we would have already taken steps before the pandemic happened, in terms of, like, providing better access to internet, providing better access to broadband, to like 4G and
For
5G,
sure. Yeah.
and making sure that all these different groups like had access to like technology at the same level, so that that wouldn't show up in higher inequality after the pandemic, for example. In the context of schooling, right, like most of the schooling like shifted online. Some people, many students, like actually did not have access to good internet. Some had better access to internet than others, and that shows up in like outcomes for like learning and grades, and like which might have effects like in the long term, right? So if we had all these measures, like going back a few years, and if you were keeping track of them over time, policymakers could have like proactively made like actions in order to, like, let's say, reduce the inequality in terms of access to digital technologies.
Right, that makes a lot of sense, and I would think intuitively, at least, that the implications of such, say, policy ignorance, or just that not having that data around, would be a lot more magnified for developing countries. And I'm also curious, how do you think your findings would have differed if your research was focused in a developing country like India? Like,
Yeah,
would you? Yeah.
so I don't have data from
Right.
India yet, but I think my prior would be that, relative to the income levels, the welfare people get from digital goods as a percentage of how much money they make would be higher in developing countries. And the reason for that is, irrespective of where you are, like if you're in India or in the US or in Europe, all of us, have access to the same Google search, have access to the same Facebook and same WhatsApp. Like you, irrespective of where you are, you get access to the same product for free. Uh, and when you look at platforms like WhatsApp, the average Indian spends more time on these platforms compared to many other countries. So someone in India has access to all these, like for example, all the videos on YouTube for free, and and in some types of settings, they even spend more time on these platforms compared to other countries. So relative to your income levels, I think, countries like India actually might have a bigger chunk of welfare which they get from digital products compared to other countries. And one of the big reason for that is in India, like internet access has like gone up a lot over the past 10 years, especially when it comes to mobile devices, right? Hundreds of millions of people came online over the past few years. So if you look at the change in welfare from digital goods, that would be a big number in a country like India, where people went online for the first time and have access to all these same products which people in the US have for free.
Right. That's very interesting. And I was also thinking, do you think like the way that you said that the welfare, the percentage of the time that you spent on, say the digital on digital goods, is higher for developing countries. Do you think that is perhaps because the substitutes that are available in like developed countries are like not as easily accessible or affordable to people in developing countries?
Yeah. No, that's a good empirical question. I don't have an answer to that question because I don't know the data. But that's a good hypothesis. I personally am not sure. Like in the Indian context, for example, part of the reason could be that if you take messaging apps, right, like you just have access to probably a much bigger network, in India compared to like a smaller country in Europe, for example, because your network effects might be stronger. But you're also right, it could also be, due to lack of other substitutes outside, in the non-digital space. I don't have the answer to that, but that's a good hypothesis. Yeah.
Right. And I'm also curious, like, have the findings of your research been imputed in any policy design so far?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you know, right, like policy, like having an impact on policy, like takes a lot of time. So, I mean, I've been presenting this research over the past few years at various places, including like IMF, OECD, and also the Bank of England, the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the US. So, I've been presenting this research at various places. In the UK, the Office of National Statistics, which is like basically the national statistics agency, they have created a project building up on my research, where they have gone ahead and measured similar things which we did, for Facebook and other social media platforms and search engines. So they have done a project trying to measure what we did in the context of UK. I don't know if they have used the results from that project in actual policy making. That remains to be seen. But there are some efforts in the UK and elsewhere where people are replicating some of these methods in their contexts. For these, for that to show up in actual policy, I think might take some time. But for example, there were some reports in the UK and US when it comes to antitrust regulations. Like should we break up Facebook or not? And policymakers had to come up with numbers for how much value these platforms create, and in that context, they have used numbers from my research looking at like how much people will get from Facebook and etc. It's hard to again attribute that the results to what they actually did, but it's definitely showing up in terms of like mentions in like various policy reports.
Right. And out of curiosity, the on the antitrust front, did your numbers make the case harder for Facebook? Because I would assume it would, because such welfare like such a huge amount of welfare generation from a single app would definitely count for something on the antitrust front. So, do you know of what impact it may have had?
Yeah, so I also have some research in that space. So basically, right, like when we think about antitrust and like should we break up Facebook or not, the main criteria, at least in the US, they look at is to see if if a particular platform like Facebook, is it causing harm to consumers or not. And my research put some dollar numbers on like how much value you get from Facebook. Of course, there are also many other types of harms which are not captured right in these numbers. For
Right.
example, like is social media like making you like unhappy, or is social media like affecting democracy? Like there are many big questions around it, and those harms are not captured in these numbers. This is just part of the story, right? It's not the full story.
Right.
So definitely these numbers help you like make a case, but like to properly account for like should we break up Facebook or not, we should look at the whole picture, right, like what
Yeah,
are
for
the
sure.
other negative externalities which these platforms might create, and on net, is it a positive to society or not. Another interesting important point which we need to keep track of is like what is the counterfactual, right? Like if you do break up Facebook, what would happen to welfare? And in some of my research, what we find is that like if you break up social media platforms into smaller platforms, that might affect welfare in a negative way. And the reason for that is once you have multiple platforms, network effects might be weaker, as opposed to like being on one platform and having stronger network effects.
Right.
So it's not an easy question, and I'm sure policymakers in most countries will continue to debate this. But this research provides like one way of measuring the value you get from products, and that might help policymakers in making a case. Yeah.
I was just curious on the negative externalities end about how is there any existing research that looks into valuing these negative externalities? Because or do you think your existing methodology or these massive online experiments, do you think those would work as effectively for measuring negative externalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in the context of measuring consumer surplus, we stay within the standard neoclassical economic framework, and we put a dollar amount on how much value you get from these products. If you want to measure, let's say, the true impact of social media on like happiness or well-being, you would probably look at other measures, right? Like surveying people about their happiness levels, about their life satisfaction. And there is some new research which came out after we published our research. One paper which was published in the American Economic Review finds that once you take away access to Facebook, overall like well-being in terms of happiness might actually increase a little if you give up access to Facebook. So while so what that shows is that these products might create positive dollar amounts in terms of consumer surplus. They might not make you better off in terms of happiness or life satisfaction. So there is definitely that trade-off. It's similar to like any kind of product, right? Like let's take like Coke or Pepsi, right? Like if you drink more of it, it shows up in GDP, it shows up in your consumer surplus. It might not make you healthy, so it might show up negatively in terms of like other outcomes. So in terms of happiness and well-being, there is some evidence which was published so far, which shows that social media platforms might not increase your happiness levels, but at the same time they do increase your consumer surplus. So our framework still stays within the neoclassical framework and tries to stay in the consumer surplus point of view. For the full picture, right, policymakers should look at production measures like GDP. They should also look at consumer surplus estimates from our metrics like GDPB. And of course, they should also look at other subjective well-being measures like happiness and life satisfaction metrics. So instead of looking at one number, the goal is to look at a dashboard of metrics. And my co-author Eric Brynjolfsson like makes this point, right? Like when you drive a car, right? Like you have various metrics on the dashboard, right? Like your speed, and you have how much fuel left, and
Right,
like
right.
various other things. So as a policymaker, you should be looking at all of these metrics, and trying to make those trade-offs, in as opposed to like focusing on one number.
That is a very interesting analogy, and I think that's something we could all use while making black or white decisions about anything in life. And on a personal note, rather, as an academic and someone who has worked in this field for a while, um, what digital social media platform would you pay the most to retain, or would you have to be compensated the most to let go of? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so for me it would be WhatsApp. That's the primary way I basically stay in touch with my family back in India, and also at the same time that's the main platform on which I co-author and collaborate with other researchers across the world. So in my case, that would have to be WhatsApp. Yeah.
I'm sure that's the case for a lot of us in India also. And I have no more questions on my
Yeah.
end. Is there anything else interesting about your research that you would like to add, or any comments that you would have for our audience?
Yeah, just one last point I guess I would like to make is, like you can use these like methods, right? Like measuring consumer surplus, like you can use them not only to measure well-being, but even if, let's say, in the context of a company, right? Like if you want to measure, like let's say, how well your product is doing, and like in terms of impact on your customers, the standard way you would do it, is to run some kind of a net promoter score, or like some survey question. Instead of that, a better metric could be, to use these methods like online choice experiments, like ask your customers how much compensation they would need, in order to stop using your product. And such a framework can be used also by firms in order to like keep track of how well their product is doing. And that has implications for managers. So that is another angle you could take this work towards. Yeah. So that's all I had to say for today. Yeah.
Right. I think that's a very nice concluding note, because I will spend a lot of time thinking about how much I will need to be compensated to do any action. I think I'll be making a lot of my life decisions now on with that question. And thank you so much for talking to us. It was wonderful having you here.
Yeah. Thanks, Neha. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Policy Room, produced by the Social and Political Research Foundation. SPRF is a youth oriented public policy think tank based in New Delhi, working to spark dialogues for a better democracy. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon.